Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's event. I'm Nandini Rao, Director of Orient BlackSwan. And it's my privilege to introduce to you today Professor K. Srinath Reddy, who has consented to inaugurate the Orient BlackSwan ONE event on education. Professor Srinath Reddy is the President of the Public Health Foundation of India and was formerly head of the Department of Cardiology at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. He was the first Bernard Lown Visiting Professor of Cardiovascular Health at the Harvard School of Public Health and held the post from 2009 to 2013. He presently serves as an adjunct professor of epidemiology at Harvard. He is also adjunct professor of the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University and is honorary professor of medicine at the University of Sydney. He holds advisory positions in several national and international bodies. We are proud to say that Professor Reddy's recent book titled Make Health in India, Reaching a Billion Plus, was published by Orient BlackSwan last year. Under his leadership, the Public Health Foundation of India has established 5 Indian Institutes of Public Health in different regions of the country to advance multidisciplinary public health education, research, health technologies, and provide implementation support to strengthen health systems. Professor Reddy is the first Indian to be elected to the National Academy of Medicine of the US and has been awarded several prestigious international and national doctorates and fellowships. He was awarded the Padmabhushan in 2005. Professor Reddy is a member of the Government of India Technical Task Force for COVID-19. He is also an advisor on public health to the governments of Odisha, Punjab, and Andhra Pradesh. I'm deeply honored to welcome Professor Reddy today, and I request him to inaugurate the Orient BlackSwan ONE events on education with his talk titled Safe Learning Environments in the Post-COVID World. We look forward to learning about COVID-19, as well as how all of us in the field of education can help children cope with the uncertainty and chaos that it has brought in its wake. Thank you, Professor, for being with us today. And before handing over to Professor Reddy, I'd just like to inform you that Professor Reddy will be happy to answer any questions you might have at the end of this talk. Considering the number of participants at this event, may I request you to please type your questions into the Q&A box of the Zoom window. My colleague, Dr. Vani Vasudevan, will collate the questions and post them to Professor Reddy for his response. Thank you very much. Professor Reddy, may I now request you to address the participants?
Thank you very much, Nandini ji. It's a pleasure to be joining all of you this afternoon. Though I must confess, there is a certain element of trepidation in addressing so many school principals and teachers. For someone who never had formal school education till class 6, and then had a fairly strict disciplinarian Catholic school principal to guide us, there is a certain degree of awe and some degree of trepidation that still persists. Nevertheless, I recognize this is not only an experience that offers me an opportunity to present my views to this distinguished group, but also to learn from them in the interaction that I hope will be quite enriching and will follow the brief remarks that I'll make. You mentioned the post-COVID world. Well, we are still transiting through the COVID world. I suppose it is the post-COVID world after the advent of COVID rather than after the departure of COVID that we are going to be discussing this afternoon. Though we would all be anxious to see the true post-COVID world where COVID has actually exited from this planet in terms of its fearsome effects, even if it lingers on as a mild virus brought to discipline. Now, let me begin by talking a little bit about where we are in India on the COVID situation. Clearly, we see frightening numbers every day being reported in the media, whether it's electronic or print media. But when we actually look at the numbers as adjusted for the population size, we are still not in such a high level of caseload or mortality as several of the countries of Europe or North America. That's no reason for complacency, but the reason I'm beginning with these statistics, based on whatever are the reported figures from the government, is that we should be able to place our situation both in terms of where we are now and where we need to act so that we don't have greater dangers lying ahead. While we are told that we are close to about 4 lakhs of cases overall, in terms of cases per million, we are at 284 per million. In terms of deaths, we are close to 13,000 deaths, but in terms of per million, which is the population size adjusted figure, we are about 9.7 per million. Contrast this with the United States, which has about 2.27 million cases and about 121,000 deaths, which gives us a rate of about 7,000 cases per million and 366 deaths per million. That means even our case count is lower than the death count of the United States. However, this is not a reason for complacency, because we are seeing the COVID-19 situation in a very differentiated manner across the country. Several of the large cities where COVID-19 entered through international airports and then radiated to adjoining areas are still battling COVID-19 virus. Many parts of India, particularly rural, but also much of the eastern part of India, is unaffected or very mildly touched. And that is where we could have a battle zone in the future if we do not take adequate precautions and contain the spread of the virus. So this is an area that is still evolving, and we cannot fully lay our bets except to say that there is much to save and protect. Now, in terms of what are the protective factors that are helping India so far to keep our death rate low, undoubtedly, it is the younger age of the population compared to Europe or North America. Also, the large segment of the rural population, which is far less mobile. And we know that mobile populations, particularly urban mobility, has a strong factor, strong role to play in the spread of the virus. And the mobility in rural areas is much less. But there are also adverse factors. Despite the younger age, we find that some of the comorbidities like diabetes, high blood pressure, even cardiovascular disease, chronic respiratory disease, air pollution, which affects the lungs, even chronic kidney disease because of diabetes and hypertension, all of these are fairly widely prevalent even in the middle-aged population of India, which means that mere age alone is not necessarily a very strong protective factor, especially in our urban populations. So we have to take that also as a factor into account. At the same time, a weak health system, which is now facing a great deal of stress in urban areas, but is going to be even more challenged in the smaller cities and towns, as well as in the rural part of India, is also going to be under great stress if we are going to be seeing a spread of the virus. Therefore, all the more important for us to take protective measures as we move along, but still there is a considerable degree of hope that we can actually contain the damage if we act firmly and fast. Now, in that setting, how can we protect the health, well-being, and the educational development of our school-age children? Clearly, when I'm talking about health, I'm not talking merely in terms of physical health, but also in terms of mental health, and all the social dimensions of development which ultimately impact upon wholesome health. And that is where I believe you as educators are really looking for that wholesome development of a child. And you're hoping that both in terms of physical and mental health and social and educational development, we will be able to soon restore some level of services to our children with adequate protection. Now, the question is, what are the kind of scenarios we might be dealing with? Firstly, if the school opening is delayed, then how are we going to actually facilitate learning at home? It is not left alone to the parents. Parents and teachers are partners in the whole educational effort. And therefore, the schools are rightly concerned about how the educational milestones of the young child who is isolated at home are going to progress if the schools do not reopen. And what would be the kind of positive learning environments at home that can be created, and what are the negative learning environments that should be avoided. Then the second question, of course, comes in is, if the schools do reopen soon, then under what circumstances are they going to be reopening, in which settings? Because as I said, different parts of India are facing different scenarios. So depending upon that scenario, what is the setting in which the school is going to be reopening? And how do we actually achieve our safety and learning objectives in those circumstances? And how do we maintain a good level of physical activity as well, which is one of the concerns that the educators have voiced at school. Now, in terms of settings, we are talking about home as an important setting. And once the school reopens, we are looking at transport to the school as an important setting, particularly if there are going to be school buses or public transport or parent-provided transport. Then within the school itself, how do we manage both physical safety as well as learning and development in terms of even physical activity? Also, there are other settings that we need to pay some attention to. The neighborhood, even if the child is now, in a sense, not coming to school, but there is an opportunity for social interaction and possible physical exposure in the neighborhood. What about the markets? All of these are going to be important elements. Of course, who are the people we need to consider? The children, of course, parents and others at home, whether it's relatives or domestic help or delivery persons who are delivering at home. All of these are important people that we need to take into account. Teachers, other school personnel, transport staff who are transporting the children to the school. How do we actually ensure that there is little physical danger from and to each of these categories, and how there is pleasant and nurturing social interaction with each of these? Those are areas that we need to explore as we look at the child's physical safety and development, as well as social and educational development. Now, in terms of when is it safe and what is the risk to the children? Now, it has been generally said that the children, particularly the teenagers, can acquire the infection fast because of their greater social mobility. Of course, if they're going to be restricted mostly at home, that exposure is limited, but nevertheless, they're as much at risk as anybody else, and particularly more if they're young and very mobile, in being at the risk of exposure to the virus. But in terms of actually developing fairly severe illness, they seem to be at a very low risk indeed. Previously, it was being said that they're virtually at no risk, but now it is known that there is a condition which actually has multiple sites of inflammation manifesting in the children, and it has been given a particular name. But even this occurs in a small percentage of the children who are exposed, and usually there are no serious after effects, and generally the recovery is fairly quick. Therefore, the physical risk to the children of exposure to the virus is not much. Are they carriers of the virus that put other people at risk? Well, that has been one major consideration right from the beginning of the epidemic about social distancing or physical distancing, how children should not actually come into contact with the virus and carrying it back to the elders at home and put them at risk. But even there, we are not very sure what is the level of virus carriage that's going to happen through the children. Because if they're going to be mostly asymptomatic, are they going to be really virus emitters or transmitters? The jury is still out on that yet. We now know that even asymptomatic as well as particularly pre-symptomatic people can actually carry the virus and possibly infect others with some activities like loudspeaking, singing, and a pre-symptomatic person suddenly breaking into a cough or a sneeze when they become symptomatic, they can actually transmit the virus. But we do not still know yet how many of the children are likely to be actually both carrying the virus and transferring it to others. The jury is still out on that yet. But nevertheless, in the state of uncertainty, we have to play safe, which means that essentially all the rules of physical distancing, masks, and hand hygiene will have to be observed both for the children as well as for the elders at home. Now, what are the conditions in which the transmission can take place? Firstly, the distance. The longer the distance between two people, the less the risk of transmission, and that's why 2 meters has been fixed somewhat arbitrarily. It could be 1.5 meters, it could be 2 meters, or in some conditions of wind velocity and flow, it could be even 3 meters, but 2 meters seems to be the current common sense recommendation. Then the duration of exposure. If the duration of exposure is fairly long to a person, the risk increases. On the other hand, if you're just walking by a person in the market, then the risk from that person is very little. Airflow concentration matters. Indoor environments are more likely to have the virus hanging around and getting concentrated, whereas outdoor environments with a good airflow are unlikely to pose a risk. And therefore, that is also a lesson for the schools in terms of classroom versus the verandas and the playgrounds. Then, is it a crowded area or not a crowded area? The larger the crowd, the more the people you're exposed to. Is it a narrow alleyway or a broad lane? Again, it depends. If you're going through a narrow route, then you're more likely to crowd with many people. On the other hand, if you have a much more open lane, even for walking past, then it's likely to be much less dangerous. But then we also recognize that there is a huge fear factor that's come in, not only the parents, but also among the children and adolescents. And the fear exists both about their personal health, about the risk they pose to others, especially people at home, but also about their future. What is happening to this world in terms of their own educational and career opportunities? What is happening to the economy of the country and global economy? Are they going to have a bleak future, or are they going to have a fairly assured future soon enough so that their investment in education is going to be fruitful? All of these are factors that can generate fear and anxiety, and we do need to deal with them. But how do we deal with that? Because we ourselves are fairly uncertain. But we have to draw some confidence from some historic parallels. We know that in 1918, there was a huge flu pandemic which killed about 50 million people. Our scientific knowledge was much more limited then, though even then masks were recommended. And there was a fair amount of devastation in the world in terms of the economy as well. But soon enough, the world economy rebounded back. There was huge development. And despite the Second World War, we have seen the developmental process bringing in a great deal of prosperity, development, and scientific and technological advances to the world. So we'll have to reassure our children that this is a passing chapter in our history, that we have to deal with it with caution, but also with confidence. And then that their future is going to be assured. It is the responsibility of the entire adult generation to ensure that their future is not going to be compromised, even if we are going to have some temporary setbacks. And therefore, we have also to teach them faith in science and solidarity, because I think this is a great opportunity to teach them about the value of science. In a situation where we are seeing a lot of anti-science movements, when there is a great deal of discussion now on the virus, on immunity and treatments and how to actually prevent this infection, there is a great opportunity to discuss science with them and build up their confidence in science. That even if science doesn't know everything today, even if it does make some mistakes, it is able to retrace and then come up with answers soon enough. It is that respect for science that we can inculcate in them, and also a spirit of social solidarity. That the whole world and all of India is in it together, and we need to protect each other. That spirit of social solidarity is something that we can bring about. So apart from the negative feelings, we ought to be able to nurture a lot of positive feelings and spirit. How do we actually address learning in this setting? Obviously, it's going to be difficult, whether at home or at school. School, of course, will provide a structured learning. But at home, how do we actually ensure that there is learning opportunity beyond their addiction to social media, and also possibly spending a lot of time in front of their computers or phones? So what we'll have to look at is, how can we encourage creative activities at home with the parents, with other siblings, but also with their peers? And I would suggest that projects that can be done, very creative projects that can be done as group activities between classmates, with peers, on email rather than through other social media. Why not give them an opportunity to explore various topics? Like, for example, the whole area of nutrition. Why is it that we recognize that innate immunity is a major factor in building protection against the virus, and it varies among persons to persons? So why is it that we cannot teach them the importance of nutrition, physical activity, and good sleep as building up innate immunity? So bring in the topic of COVID, but talk about innate immunity and let them explore. Let them write projects on that. Let them explore why zoonotic viruses spread from wild forest animals, where they are mild, into humans and veterinary populations, where they become much more virulent. The whole area of ecology and zoonotic diseases can easily be taught to them. Why teach them? Give them projects which they can do as groups, and work on it on email, so that they can actually come up with projects that they can complete and have the teacher assist them. So I think a lot of creative activities on life skills education and learning can be brought in during this period, which normally the schools do not have time for. Also, comorbidities. Why is it that people in their home or otherwise who have hypertension or diabetes at greater risk? Why is it that Indians seem to have more of diabetes? What is it in our food? What is it in our physical activity? This is a great opportunity for giving them information about the kind of good diets and bad diets, and what is the harm of junk foods and sugar sweetened beverages. Let them discover it for themselves. Let them do projects on that, and let the teacher guide them. So that these are the kind of opportunities that we ought to capitalize on in the COVID period, where there are multiple triggers and prompts that are there, which we can utilize. Then the question of physical activity comes in. Of course, physical activity is very critical and absolutely essential for development. But I suppose in a home environment and relatively confined, it's going to be difficult. Can we encourage calisthenics? Can we encourage skipping, which can easily be done at the individual level, and then have scores kept on the skipping? Okay, how are they improving week by week? Breathing exercises, because COVID is something that actually attacks the lungs much more. Of course, it diffuses throughout the body, but ultimately what tilts the balance is your lung capacity. So how do you increase your lung capacity? By breathing exercises, maybe yoga, pranayama, but other breathing exercises too. All of these are things that you can encourage, and then you can bring it to their conscious knowledge And they can also see themselves as change agents in their own homes. If dad or somebody else has been smoking, then can they get the person to stop smoking? Because that's going to be harmful for the lungs. So these are all the kind of things that we can encourage, but physical activity is possible through some of these elements. Can they have non-contact sports in their neighborhood with other children in the neighborhood? Are there some kind of non-contact sports that we can encourage? And if the school has reopened, what kind of non-contact sports can we encourage? Badminton, table tennis, even lane running where there is no physical contact, even creative relays. It doesn't have to be a baton that has to be passed on. People could stand at some distance from each other in a relay race and throw a ball to the next person who is to be relayed. I do not know. I'm not the creative PT teacher. I'm sure your PT teachers can come up with creative talent, or better still, let the children come up with creative games. So there are multiple ways in which we ought to be able to use the school environment to restore physical activity. I've also been asked about personal safety issues. Now, there are 3 portals of entry. One is the nose, because it's a respiratory virus. Second is the mouth. Again, it enters through that and then get into the lungs because there's a common passageway in the throat. And then the eyes, because the virus can enter the eyes. And from there, because of the nasolacrimal duct, which connects the eyes to the nose, it can enter the nose and again spread through the respiratory tract. So protection for all 3 is important. And that's why face shields are now being utilized also. But certainly mask is absolutely important. And we certainly need hand washing and physical distancing. Now, the question of sanitizers has been asked as one of the areas of interest in one of the advanced questions that came in. Sanitizers can only be used temporarily when water is not available. The best is to use running water and soap. And if running water is not available anywhere, you can keep buckets of soap water and let people just take a mug and wash their hands. But hand sanitizer is only in exceptional circumstances. It's not the rule because it is temporary. Secondly, it does have some health effects, though used infrequently, it does not do that. And it could have some toxic chemicals. It can cause endocrine disruption and alcohol poisoning if consumed. But essentially, hand sanitizer is a temporary transient measure to be used on and off when water is not readily available. But I certainly believe that we ought to educate our children not to consume it orally, because that can be problematic because there can be toxicity part of it. Now, there have been other questions that have been asked. Does this kind of frequent hand washing and hand sanitizer, etc., weaken the immune system? Well, it is true that our immunity develops with exposure to multiple microbes in our environment, and our body learns to defend itself and over a period of time acquires immunity. But of course, first thing is develop good passive immunity through a nutritious diet, good sleep, and physical activity. But in terms of acquiring immunity to different pathogens, microbes, we also recognize that a good deal of exposure would have already occurred by the time the child is of school-going age. So 1 year of hand washing is not going to remove that immunity. And later on too, it's not as though we are suddenly entering into a very pristine environment even now. There is enough of environmental hazard for us other than COVID, which we are exposed to. And while some degree of protection is going to be there because of masks and hand washing, I do not think our overall acquired immunity is going to be greatly affected in the children. But certainly, I think if we can actually build up their innate immunity, that actually will be the best guarantee against future hazards as well. In terms of social distancing, I've been asked, how is social distancing always possible? It is not always possible. But we know that even when physical distancing is not perfect or possible, usage of masks and hand washing itself has about 60% protective effect. If we can do that, that is fine. I know wearing masks is not a comfortable thing for everybody. And certainly for children and teachers are much more used to facial expressions and draw confidence from seeing a smiling teacher. It's not going to be easy to readjust to this, but let's treat it as relatively temporary. Now, how do you actually manage in the school? Can we have shifts so that we can really spread out the seating? Can we mark out positions in the school veranda and have people come in by their roll numbers turn by turn so that there are no crowded lines of entry into the school, into the classroom? All of these things can easily be worked out by the teachers depending upon the size of the school, the setting of the school. It's difficult to have a one-size-fits-all prescription for everybody, and that is something that can be looked at. But one of the important elements is do plan marked movement routes, which are with signages, so that people do not collide into each other. Whether it's clockwise or anti-clockwise or whichever way the movement is, it should be an orderly movement so that people do not collide with each other. And then, I suppose, if you do have shifts, that will also reduce the time the masks are going to be used, because when the children get back home, they can remove their masks. So these are some of the adjustments that you will have to probably do at the school level when the school reopens. But think of even entry into the classroom like something like airline boarding in groups in orderly fashion with basically whatever their serial numbers are. And in terms of, I've also been asked that what do you do with parents not ready to send to school? I suppose it's their right. I mean, ultimately they feel that they are the custodians of the child's safety. What we can do is to try and persuade them gently with reasoned arguments if it is a safe environment. In large parts of India where the virus is still not very widespread, like the smaller towns and villages, there should be far less hesitation. It's in very active containment zones of large cities that there would be continued hesitation. And you'll have to actually give your recommendation based on what the general public health recommendations or the government recommendations of the day are. But if the schools have opened and there are some parents who are unwilling, then firstly, I believe peer pressure will begin to tell, because the children themselves will keep telling their parents that other people are going to school, why are we being stopped from going to school? But the question of how homeschooling can be done to cover the syllabus, how the parents can actually be guided by the school teachers, those are things that you'll have to answer for yourself. But one of the things that you may wish to consider is not to hold too many exams, because you do it by projects. If you assign projects either individually or as a group and judge it, it becomes easier rather than standard structured exams. I must confess, as I said, I didn't have any formal schooling till class 6. And my children went to a free progress education type of system in Delhi, Mirambika, where they did not have any exams till class 5. So I'm fairly comfortable with that idea. I know the traditional schools are not, but you may have to adapt during this period with some sort of a project-oriented teaching and project-oriented assessment rather than the classical exams. I really have nothing much more to add. I would be very happy to take questions, because that is where I believe some of your real concerns beyond what I've addressed will be voiced, and I'll be happy to try and answer to the best of my ability. I'm not sure how much of confidence I can inspire in terms of the quality of my answers. You are teachers, you know much better than I do, but at least let's have a good interaction. I'm open to it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Reddy, for a very interesting presentation on situation we're in, safe learning environments in the post-COVID world. May I now request Dr. Vani Vasudevan, Director of Orient BlackSwan, to anchor the discussion and relay the questions from the participants to Professor Reddy. Vani, would you please?
Thanks, Nandini. Good afternoon, Professor Reddy.
Good afternoon.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yeah, very much so. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Let me get started with the questions. And in all fairness, I think we will take up the questions that came to us in advance of the webinar, some of which we couldn't send to you in time. So the first question is from Nazneen Vakil. And she quotes from an Australian journal, and I quote, "Children will need recess more than ever while returning to school post-coronavirus. And the recess time at school will play a crucial part, in other words. But across the world, schools are either thinking of reducing recess time or simply not having recess time as they open. So what approach must schools take?"
I fully agree with that recommendation because, as I said, open spaces are much better. Open air is much better because the virus doesn't get concentrated there. Apart from breathing fresh air and being a little more physically active, recess time actually is much better for avoiding the virus as well. Obviously, schools will have to adapt their teaching programs. I mean, we have been so far focused on, I mean, I don't want to use the word cramming, but loading a lot of learning into our students to the extent that even physical education classes are taken over by academic programs. I think we need to change that whole scenario, encourage a lot of self-directed learning at home, but use the school to stimulate, let them ask questions. I mean, there is something for adults that is being used in universities called the flipped classroom, where actually the lessons are posted to the students and the students come to the class only to discuss some of the doubts and queries, and there is peer-to-peer learning there. So I think you will have to get very creative. One of the things that COVID has to teach, has taught us, is to get creative.
Right. And speaking of...
But certainly recess time should be increased.
Right, right. We got that. Yes, thank you. But speaking of self-directed learning, Clementine Montero has a question with a lot of irony in it. She says, we had previously stopped children from using mobile phones, laptops, tablets due to the negative impact we foresaw on their health. Now they are forced to be in front of the PC and the laptop. What are your thoughts on the long-term impact of this?
Well, basically, I think if the parents and others at home, like siblings, can play a role in guiding. I mean, there can be educational quizzes that people can do even at the dining table or otherwise. There's so many activities that can be done as a group. I mean, earlier dad didn't have much time and mom was busy and siblings were busy with other activities. I think if we encourage socialization at home, that's an educational environment as well. But again, even if you have to be in front of a gadget, why not be by email, communicating with peers on a joint project? Let it be project oriented so that people actually get creative and then start looking at exploring knowledge rather than just exchanging gossip.
Or acquiring information. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Right. And this one is actually a question which really resonates with me. This is from Pradita Nambiar. She says, children with disabilities could be more marginalized now. Apart from being unable to meet their learning requirements, they also do not have a school community. They may not have a school community to laugh and play with. How can teachers best address their needs?
Well, I think this is a very important challenge.
Very important challenge, yes, yes.
And particularly also sometimes they do not get service from care providers who used to be previously visiting them. But we must try and address that through important government services which can be rendered at home, and government must use the services of NGOs who are experienced in this area to provide services at home. But along with services, there has to be empathetic conversation, which actually is supportive emotionally. At the same time, if some learning modules can also be provided to them, that will be very helpful. But certainly the whole area of government and NGO partnerships in this area becomes very important as an extension of the schooling.
Yes, yes. Thanks, Professor. I think the NGO aspect of it has to really come to the fore as far as disadvantaged children are concerned, whether with disabilities or even economically disadvantaged children. That is where the NGOs will really have a big role to play. Yes. There are actually quite a few questions on the use of the mask. And there is Wilma D'Souza and there is Gitanjali, and they've all asked, is using a mask for a longer period of time safe at all? And how long is long? You know, because can they wear a mask for 6 to 8 hours at a stretch? And should it be an N95? Should it be a cloth mask? You know, there are questions of this kind, all about the mask, use of the mask for children particularly. And some of them very pertinently say there are no children-sized masks available.
Well, basically, let me speak from personal experience. For many years, I've been a cardiologist, and I have been doing cardiac catheterization, and quite often it has been for several hours a day, you're in the catheter lab. In between cases, you may just go out for a couple of minutes and the mask may be loosened. But essentially, for a good part of the working day, I've worn a mask, my colleagues have worn a mask, nurses have worn masks. There's been no untoward effect. It can be worn. I mean, certainly it's something, it becomes a part of a second nature for people working in the healthcare area. For others, it may appear strange. But in terms of children, certainly if we can reduce schooling time and more recess time in the school too, then I think they'll get a lot more fresh air, because when they go back home, they don't have to wear masks. If there are no child-sized masks, we can have them stitched, or even a thick cloth, double-layered cloth wound around the face will suffice. Or face shields. I mean, while now masks and face shields are being worn together, as I said, eyes are also to be protected, and there are face shields available, and we can easily construct a face shield for a child. It should not be too difficult.
What are those made of, Professor? I mean, are they kind of...
They're essentially plastic sheets, with a band, with a headband. And
so no amount of vigorous physical activity is going to, you know, cause them...
No, that depends upon how well your band is fixed. I mean, now people are using it even in flights. Of course, people are using it also with a mask, but essentially it protects the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, and prevents your spit from going out and the other person's spit from landing on you. So these are some of the things that are being used, and therefore there are multiple ways we can actually protect the children, either with customized cloth masks that we can make for them, or even use of some of the other elements like face shields.
Okay, right. But it takes some getting used to, at least for a child, you know, to have that kind of sense of inhibition that the shield will probably bring about.
Most certainly. No, I agree. It is not something that is pleasant. And I mean, if I were a child, I would not want to wear it, except to pretend I'm Zorgo or Phantom or something like that.
Exactly.
To do the play acting. But I suppose you'll have to tell them it's not only to protect themselves, but to protect the elders at home, so that they don't carry anything back home. So it's a question of giving them the reasons why, and I'm sure they'll get convinced. But once back at home, they need not be there. Now, this is a face shield. I hope you're able to see that. It comes with a headband. It comes with a headband.
Right.
Yeah. So this is it can be made even with any plastic sheet, actually.
Right. Yeah, they need to be talked to and to be told, how important it is, for their own safety. So I think that persuasion and that schooling of their understanding is very necessary.
Well,
The next
yeah, they can pretend, they can think of themselves as masked superheroes.
bring a little bit of fiction, play acting into it. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
The next question is very broad, but it's far-reaching. What would be the impact on pupils if 2020 were to be declared as a zero academic year?
I would,
Bandied
if,
about in on the TV channels, so I think this question comes from there.
if I were a student, I would feel deliriously happy. But I think even as an adult, I would not be unhappy, because I think there are lots of learning ways and lots of things to be learned. You're learning about the world, you're learning about the environment, you're learning about health, you're learning about social solidarity. There's a lot more to be learned about life this year than just, rote learning. I'm sure you can even teach maths. There are so many people doing all kinds of mathematical modeling of how the virus is multiplying or dividing. So you can actually teach a lot of stuff through this.
If we look upon it as an opportunity and as not something that is gloom and doom, yes. And the other question is also about the academic load on children. And there is also talk currently that the syllabus load is going to be reduced, and your curriculum load is going to be reduced. So I guess it's a comment and not a question. Should be minimized to make separate time for yoga and pranayam and all the things that you mentioned in your talk.
Well, they can be done at school, they can be done at home. Anything that is good for promoting physical and mental health should be encouraged. I think being healthy should also be an important goal in life. And now they recognize, you see, previously, when we were telling them not to smoke, not to do this, they would think of all the ill effects as something happening in distant future. Now they know that unless their lungs have a good capacity to expand, the virus is going to be deadlier than in people who have that lung capacity. So I think there are a number of ways, or that if they eat good food, they're more likely to resist the virus. So I think there is a great opportunity for building in these lessons.
I think this is more a question of pedagogy and not really of health science, but the teachers want to know, then how do we deal? How do we deal with homework? Do we deal manually, or orally? Do we cut out written work that needs to be checked? Do we just do oral chat, oral discussions? And how do we bring about course correction in children, academic course correction?
Well, that is something I think the teachers will have to work out, as you rightly pointed out. But I would say, if we can actually build in a lot more of collaborative, project-oriented activities and have peer-to-peer learning also as an important component, and then judge them on the basis of the completed project report, that will probably be a good way of doing it. I mean, I've seen children do that in in the school that my children went to, and I was particularly happy with that process.
Right, and why not? Yes, that should be workable, and I think one should slowly, transition into that kind of approach. There are quite a few questions also, if we have time. Yes, on the mental being and the mental health of children, and particularly, I mean, my own question, this is one question that I wanted to ask. I'm happy that others have also asked this question. How do we focus on building empathy in children? That is part A of the question, which is very, very necessary now, not just resilience, but empathy. And the second part of the question is, in a social structure that there is in social structure there is in India and social habits in India, how would we deal with stigma? And how would we help children also deal with it? Because that's become, it's come to the fore even in adults, in older people. And, in children, it can be very cruel. So how do we deal with that? How do we, keep them from harm mentally?
Well, both fear and stigma and lack of empathy or building empathy are dependent mostly on adult role models at home and in society and in the media. So if we create a huge scare and begin to project the other as a threat to self, we start looking at everybody as a potential threat and an enemy. On the other hand, if we say that this is a common challenge that we need to face together, that I need to protect X and X will protect me by wearing masks, physical distancing, we're all in it together, then there is a sense of social solidarity. And the way we talk about migrants, that conversation also has to build in empathy rather than treating them with stigma. Similarly, when we talk about people in slums, one of the problems is people living in wonderful residential colonies start talking about, oh my God, these slum dwellers are going to spread the virus to us. On the other hand, the whole area of why are slums there? Why can't we actually have a more equitable society? Those are the kind of conversations that we need to have with children now. And even going beyond human to human interaction. Where did this viruses come from? Why did we destroy the forests? Why are we going in for livestock factory scale livestock breeding? So what are we doing to the environment? Now the children are very much worried about environment, but this is a very tangible issue which can be linked to environment. So empathy for other human beings as well as empathy for all of life is something that can actually be built into this conversation.
Right. Which means actually making necessary adjustments to the curriculum, changes in the curriculum, and bringing this to the foreground rather than, like you said, just information and adding more and more layers of knowledge. It's more about this critical thinking that you said and the creative thinking. I'm so happy you said that. Then there is a very pertinent question from Ms. Madhu Chung, and she says that I'm 70 plus and teaching is my passion. Is it advisable for me to continue my job? Without my students, I would be forlorn.
Well, ma'am, basically, age is just a number. It is the biology that matters. People could be 40 but biologically old. People could be 70 but biologically young. So if you do not have any major health problems like hypertension, diabetes, chronic respiratory disease, have been physically active, are not overweight or obese, then I think the danger to you of having a major illness is much less. We have seen people in 90s and 100s also, centenarians, walk out of hospitals. But ideally, you can protect yourself. The important thing is if you wear a mask, if you physically distance to some extent, as feasible in the school environment, and practice hand hygiene, then I think the risk of acquiring the infection is much less. Therefore, I think you should try and get your satisfaction. And if your emotional state is going to be negative and you're going to get depressed, that's also going to hurt your immunity. So try and do as much teaching as possible. Maybe if you can teach from home, do it. But if you want to go to school, if the schools reopen, then plan it cautiously.
Right. Thank you, Professor. I think there's a question on food from Mr. Yashwant Chamlikar. Would you like to suggest specific nutrition, especially during COVID-19? And I'm assuming it's for children in particular.
Well, basically, the best nutrition in terms of good protective chemicals or antioxidants and essential minerals comes in from fruit and vegetables, milk and milk products, nuts and seeds. These are some of the things that are important. Good sources of protein, vegetable or even limited amount of animal protein would be helpful. But I think fruit and vegetables are going to be very important because they're power packed with antioxidants, which are very, very protective. Nuts too have a lot of zinc and other essential minerals, which are very protective. So these are some of the things that we ought to be able to encourage and keep them away as much as possible from sugar-sweetened beverages and junk foods, which are likely to sort of erode the immunity.
Related to that, then, I'm actually only picking questions randomly because I'm trying to see if we can cover a cross-section of issues here. There is a question on the vitality of alternative systems of medicine, Ayurveda, naturopathy, Unani, and Siddha, and homeopathy, and so on, vis-a-vis allopathic medicine. So how far would you go to
I believe many of these traditional systems of medicine have good advice to give regarding promotion of immunity to good physical habits and dietary habits. Whether they have a role to play in actual treatment of COVID infection, it depends upon evidence that is still to be produced from good clinical trials and good research. But in terms of nutritious food, physical activity, staying away from tobacco and alcohol, that's common advice to traditional medicine and good health promotion even in allopathy.
Right. Let me see, there are any other that I missed out on. Yes. What about the mental and emotional well-being of the teachers? I think their minds are ridden with many, many anxieties of different kinds. Not least among them, the preoccupation with the children and their wellness, and how much at risk they are themselves, how exposed they could be, and how can they cope with this anxiety and this worry.
Well, basically, I think the teachers too will have to look at this as a challenge, which will last for a few months more at least, and mentally prepare themselves to deal with it with caution and confidence as a combination. And basically, they'll have to adapt to whatever the situation is in terms of the learning environment. They should take adequate caution in terms of their own personal health, particularly if they have comorbidities, they should be even more cautious. But I think the important thing is to feel optimistic and radiate that optimism to children as well. So whenever they're feeling a bit glum, I think I would recommend a combination of Sound of Music and Mary Poppins. Probably then you can actually gain all that kind of confidence that you need.
Very important, very important. The positive energy that you exude is very, very important in the classroom. I guess it's very far reaching. And the last question that I read here from Gitanjali Pawar is, how long will it take or would it take to reduce COVID impact in India? That's a very long-term view of it that she's taking, but what is your forecast, I guess?
Well, at the moment, most people who have made forecasts have stumbled because this is a new virus and we do not know how it is actually behaving. And secondly, it also depends upon how effectively the response measures are being applied, which is very variable. You have seen how Kerala, Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, and to some extent Karnataka have handled it very well, whereas some other states have not handled it very well. So we cannot really say. Globally, it would appear that we will have to wait at least till winter to see whether there's going to be a resurgence even in areas where it has quietened down. So at least till March, April next year, it'll be difficult to say whether we have really overcome COVID in a substantial fashion. But if we can slow it down markedly and keep most of the people safe and keep the rate of new cases and deaths low, then we would have achieved an objective. Vaccine is at least 1 to 1.5 years away. So we'll have to try and build up passive immunity at the same time. I mean, our own innate immunity, as well as try and slow down the transmission of the virus. So it's difficult to do the forecasting at this point in time because there have been so many uncertainties that have been brought in, both in terms of the behavior of the virus and the response of the health systems and the social systems.
Professor, in Western European countries such as Denmark or in Sweden, for instance, there's talk about herd immunity and sending children back to school early. And with none of these restrictions or none of these measures that we have talked about today, or possibly very few, and they would like to open children up or expose them to the infection and get on with it, basically. Now, what implications does that kind of concept have for our Indian context?
Well, only Sweden.
Vulnerable are we? How vulnerable are we? Yeah.
Only Sweden practiced it in Europe. Even in Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway, Finland, they actually went into a lockdown. They had masks and they had social distancing. I mean, they had physical distancing. Only Sweden decided to go by herd immunity, and they paid the price for it. Their deaths have been 4 to 5-fold higher than the other Scandinavian countries. And they're still at a high level. And also, we have seen many elderly in their nursing homes perishing. Sweden is no longer seen as a successful case model. Same thing happened with Brazil, where the president declared that there was absolutely no risk. And Brazil has now a horrendous number of cases and deaths. So herd immunity, the problem is, unless you acquire at least 70 to 80% of the population in the case of this virus, acquired the virus and have recovered, they do not block the circulation to the remaining 20-30%. That is where the herd protects the uninfected. But we are far away from that, because even in the countries where the virus has been very active, the exposure levels in the population have been only between 5 to 10%. We are far, and even in New York, it's up to 20%. So we are far away now in our country and elsewhere in the world from reaching that 70 to 80%. Secondly, for theoretical reasons, if you assume that in Delhi, for example, about 70% people are infected and the remaining 30 are protected because the virus has stopped circulating, because others are blocking it. Now, if anybody from this 30% travels to Raipur or Ranchi, where only 10 to 20% have been infected, this person is still vulnerable in that new area. So therefore, I think herd immunity is a bit of a myth as far as the world is concerned. At least it will happen eventually, but not in the next 1 year.
Right. Well, I think I've kind of covered the cross-section that I wanted to, and other questions are actually, more repetitive and more of the same, but, you've addressed all of them so comprehensively and, with such tremendous insight, and I think to their great satisfaction. So thank you, Professor, for dealing with all these queries, and over to Nandini.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to ask you to mark me. I don't know what grades you will give me, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Reddy. Thank you for being with us today and for engaging with the participants and answering all their questions. In a short time of just 30 minutes, Professor Reddy covered a vast range of topics, from the current spread of the disease in India to making suggestions for the kind of safety measures that schools should consider. It was particularly interesting that you, Professor Reddy, emphasized the need to reassure children that this is a passing phase and that the world will recover. You spoke at length about creative ways in which children could learn at home and at school, and the kind of topics like nutrition that they could learn. So this, Professor Reddy suggested, could be done often through projects and group interaction, even remotely. Professor Reddy covered a number of other issues in the answers to the very questions that the participants asked. And I actually found it particularly interesting that he spoke about using the crisis as an opportunity to develop feelings of empathy and solidarity. That really resonated with Professor Reddy. Professor Reddy spoke at length about the precautions schools should take when they are allowed to open. He was confident that teachers would find innovative ways to maintain physical distancing while holding class. He was sure that schools would think of creative ways to ensure physical safety without contact. These are just a few of the wide-ranging suggestions that Professor Reddy made in his talk. I'd like to thank all the participants for joining us and making this interesting session even more interesting through their interactions. And I'd like to thank my colleague, Dr. Vani Vasudevan, for anchoring the discussion. Thank you so much, Dr. This is the first of many events that we at Orient BlackSwan hope to organize. And we look forward to welcoming all of you at them. Professor Reddy, I hope you will find the time to join us at our future events. But thank you, meanwhile, thank you so very much for today. It's been so wonderful. And I wish you all a very good evening. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.